My name is Nandini, and I'm from Red Ant, and we're a new socialist organization working to rebuild internationalist Marxism and anti-imperialist Marxism across Australia. I'd like to say a big thank you to CRAM, Critical Research at Melbourne, Association Melbourne, with whom we're co-hosting this event. So that's thanks to Joe, Jess, Justin, and Elliot, and everyone else who was involved. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to the international Marxist historian, journalist, and thinker, Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and more recently, On Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle, which was published with Noam Chomsky. Vijay is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief correspondent for Globetrotter Media. We're lucky, very, very lucky to host Vijay all across Australia. So this talk is part of a series of talks that Red Ant has organised through Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, and then Perth. So tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m, we will be hosting a day-long teach-in on the topic of building socialism and anti-imperialism, which will be held at uni, but at the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Theatre in Arts West. So tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m, remember it. Oh yeah, that's a venue change. So due to overwhelming demand, we are now in the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Theatre. So I had to make a few introductory remarks. So last night, while I was trying to explain like why on earth we've put so much time and effort, and Vijay has come all the way from Chile and done so many talks and is doing so many talks in Australia, I realized there was a bit of a feeling that I wanted to explain. And I often feel like when Marxists talk about the last few decades of political activity in Australia, we talk about the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, about neoliberalization, about ecological crisis, about the fall in union participation rates. People living through these times, and I feel like this, have, maybe we find it hard to admit, but a small part of us feels like history kind of has ended. Like all we can expect is the same kind of dreary and extremely destructive capitalism, the same kind of Australian and American imperialism, and that's what the world is going to always look like. But I've come to realize this view is myopic. And Brendan and I realized that we both got a bit teary while we were reading this book, Vijay's book called Red Star Over the Third World, because real communists do cry. In the very first pages of his book, Vijay quotes Ho Chi Minh, and I was going to flip open the pages because I'm really learned, but I actually can't do that. So I've written it down. And the quote from Ho Chi Minh goes, "Like the brilliant sun, the October Revolution shone over all 5 continents, awakening millions of oppressed and exploited people all over the world. There has never existed such a revolution of such significance and scale in the history of humanity." And for me, the key question that Vijay raises in his book and throughout all of his work is, when does a revolution end? And the answer that he gives is revolutions don't. For Ho Chi Minh, who wrote this passage in 1967 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, the legacy of that great event was still active in his world, in the same way that it's active in Vietnamese, Cuban, Indonesian, Filipino, Cape Verdean, Burkinabe, Venezuelan revolutions that are active today. And it lives on, that sun, that heart, that heat, it lives on through our comrades in the global south who continue to struggle under that light that Ho Chi Minh felt himself. And this is because Marx once wrote, "Communism is above all the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. The form in which communism has its concrete existence in our world is the movement itself, the course of active struggle." For us in Red Ant, part of that project of anti-imperialist Marxism is to orient ourselves through history and also through the present struggles, which are ongoing testaments to the fact that that history has not ended. Of the many values of Vijay's work, maybe the greatest is the fact that it compels us to be attentive to the actuality of revolution in the 20th century, which so often takes the form and has taken the form and still takes the form of national liberation in the global south, which he will talk to you about today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Vijay Prashad.
It's great to be here. This is, I think, for Atul and I, Atul is our fourth day in Australia. I'm really grateful to Red Ant for taking us around. A couple of days ago, we were driving through Canberra, the secret city, and we saw seagulls flying over the federal parliament. We made a dash to the federal parliament to see how the Australian intelligence service has been training a flock of seagulls to fly around the world and spy on all of us. Then we learned to our dismay that the security guard sitting beside us didn't even care about our presence. So we watched those seagulls, and I got a real sense of the proximity on this really very large part of the planet Earth that you have with nature, because we also saw a kangaroo. It was really quite beautiful, and I'm very happy that we've had this experience with Red Ant. I'm really happy to be here with you at CRAM. What a great acronym. I met one of your colleagues, Lydia, in Sydney, and she was already talking up what you all are doing here at the University of Melbourne. It's not often that I get to talk at universities. Generally, I think faculty don't really like to invite maybe this kind of topic or something into university classrooms. Somebody once said to me, "You're too demagogic for thought." And, we think, and you sort of are a demagogue. And I thought, well, it's a good thing for students every once in a while to experience a little demagogy, although I don't think I'm a demagogue, but, I believe things. And I think a lot of people who teach in universities also believe things. But there is this pressure not to believe in things. To believe that you don't need to believe is something that a kind of neoliberal, thought imposes on our institutions. That to believe is to not be somebody that can be trusted. If you believe in something, a tradition, a framework of certain kind of thought, you're not as trustworthy as somebody who doesn't believe. In other words, let's just make a society of opportunists. That seems to be a better way to go, which is why you have the prime minister you have. So, that sort of attitude leads right to Anthony Albanese. And that attitude leads to Olaf Scholz. It leads to Keir Starmer. It leads to Kamala Harris. It leads to basically a form of, institutional mediocrity. And that's really what's happened in many Western states. The leaders are just really difficult to get behind. I mean, name one that excites you. They're just pathetic. And you're stuck in this position of having to decide between two pathetic candidates who don't believe in anything. And, and you're supposed to trust one because the other is worse. I mean, look at the US election. One is has a record of being involved in a genocide, and the other one is the one people are supposed to be scared of. So what's worse than a genocide? You already have a genocidaire as a vice president, but the other one is worse. I'm afraid I don't get it any longer. I don't get how mediocrities compete against each other, but, that's where we are. And so demagoguery, I suppose, should make a comeback. People should believe things some more. And I'm a great advocate of students learning to be sincere and not cynical. There's no need to be cynical about what you believe in. Believe in something. The people I'm going to talk about believed a lot. They sacrificed their lives for their belief. They gave up honors and distinction for their belief. Some won, many didn't, but they believed. They wanted to make the world better. The world is atrocious. Today, the world is in an atrocious state. And we have generations of people being taught to get degrees who leave their institutions with an attitude of cynicism toward the world. We mustn't let that continue. We got to teach sincerity. You got to believe things. You got to try to do things in the world. You can't just worry about the small things in life, which is just how your life will turn out. Because your life sometimes might turn out and millions of others' lives might be in great peril as a consequence. It's always worth being sincere. These people I'm going to talk about were extremely sincere. I want to start by, well, I already started, but that was like a preliminary starting. I want to actually start by explaining what this institute is where Atul and I work, Tricontinental. Because in a sense, the material I'm going to share with you is a consequence of the work that we've done in our institute. About a decade ago, I received effectively a summons from the landless workers movement in Brazil, the MST, the largest social movement in Latin America. About 1 million or so, maybe 2 million people involved in their settlements, their encampments and so on. I think about 1 million members of the MST. Well, they have a school just outside Sao Paulo called the Florestan Fernandes National School. Florestan Fernandes is a very important Brazilian Marxist that doesn't get read outside Brazil. In fact, even within the Brazilian Academy, he's not taken seriously. He threw himself into trying to theorize the movements in Brazil at the time. He writes incredibly powerful work about the relevance of Marxism in the fight against the dictatorship and then in the 1990s against neoliberalism. So I went to this meeting in the Florestan Fernandes School, and they had about 20 or so political and social movements from Africa, Asia, and Latin America at the meeting. The meeting was very interesting because it was, in a sense, a place, a space to start thinking about the status of internationalism in the first months of the new decade, the second decade of the 21st century. And what the conversation turned to immediately was an assessment of the World Social Forum, which had emerged out of the anti-globalization movements in the 1990s and had actually been shaped and formed in Porto Alegre in Brazil in response to the emergence, not the creation, this has an earlier history, but the emergence in a much more dramatic way of the World Economic Forum, a meeting held every year in Davos, Switzerland, where the billionaire elites go in their jet planes and so on and spend a week listening to lectures by academics and politicians and so on, trying to shape an intellectual agenda for the world. In fact, there are a number of these places where the intellectual agenda of the elite is shaped. Don't think that they don't spend time thinking about, in conceptual terms, where the world is going. They meet at Aspen in Colorado. They meet in just outside San Francisco. These are not conspiracies. These are just meetings. I mean, they just meet. They talk about their view of the world. They shape concepts. Those concepts come out in the World Economic Forum's publication. They influence the OECD, the Organization of Economic, whatever it is, the European, and where I live also, Chile is part of the OECD, unfortunately. Then they influence and shape the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other multilateral institutions. It's not, in fact, ineffectual concept making. It's very important concept making that the World Economic Forum does. For instance, they put things like the environment on the agenda, but they shaped it into the importance of having green capitalism, carbon credits. All of that comes out of the WEF. They had an enormous discussion about the digital economy, how governance of the digital economy should be shaped. That debate didn't happen in multilateral institutions. It was imposed on them. The WEF had already sort of shaped a conceptual agenda, a very sophisticated agenda, but the gap, the democracy deficit, as it were, in the shaping of these concepts is enormous. So the World Social Forum was supposed to have been a reaction. Unfortunately, and that was the assessment in Brazil, the World Social Forum didn't live up to what it should have done. Partly by the 2000s, late 2000s, the World Social Forum, 70% of the participants came funded by US foundations, Ford Foundation, the Soros Open Society, and so on. So basically, the agenda was being set between US foundations and attack from Europe, where the European foundations also were beginning to bring in this idea that focus on environment or focus on, labor rights. They were sort of parceling the world up into that NGO methodology of let's look at this problem, the water problem. Let's look at the problem of sewage over here. But they weren't looking at the whole. There was no Marxism underlying things. In fact, if I was to be cruel to what had happened, there was no real theory underlying things. This was a form of NGOism where you take issues that you think need solutions and you deal with them. Let's have a panel on the water problems. Let's have a panel over here on gay and lesbian issues. Let's have a panel over there. But what about, let's say, the interlocking way in which these various problems go? We don't have a theory of the whole. How are you going to deal with the whole? At Davos, they had a theory of the whole. They didn't have any problem understanding the whole. They didn't need to look at the world in fragments. But this sort of NGOized anti-globalization left had kind of brought the agenda of US and European foundations into the World Social Forum. These were two serious problems. 70% of the people there funded by these foundations, and the agenda effectively an NGO agenda. So the people at this meeting said, we need to build something different. And the idea this time was, let's not build something that's going to be, a festival once a year where people can come and there's lots of slogans and, flags to sell, and you go home with a suitcase full of T-shirts and whatnot, and you got all kinds of ways of feeling good about your participation at the annual WSF meeting. It's not a festival. We got to build a movement. We got to reconstruct internationalism. And so they decided to launch a decade-long process of bringing political and social movements into a network, into conversations with each other. One of the things that came out of this meeting was that the lessons that we've learned from studying the experience of the Communist International must be absorbed. One of the, I think, most important lessons from the Communist International was that it sort of wrapped itself up between the needs of Soviet foreign policy, in other words, the national interests or the multinational interests of the USSR, and internationalism. There were times, like for instance, with the People's Republic of China now, where the government has to act based on the national interests of the country, which is different many times from an international perspective. You can't expect a country where you have people that you're governing, you can't expect the policy of that country not to think about the needs of the people in the country. You can't sacrifice the people for an international perspective. That's just not going to happen. It's actually super idealistic to expect that. So we thought, look, we don't want to have an international that tells movements what to do, that instructs movements on a political line. And I think we came to an interesting point, which I'm going to come back to when I talk to you a little about Ho Chi Minh, which is that the most important way to build unity is through the trust between movements. Trust is much more important than a singular political line. Different political organizations are at different stages of their development. They operate in different conjunctures. They have different class situations that they're dealing with. You cannot have one interpretation of the world that suits everybody. It's just not going to happen. You can't build mass organizations by imposing a political line that doesn't make sense in that concrete reality. But you can build trust across movements. For instance, right now, when Russia enters Ukraine, obviously the Europeans that are involved in our network cannot immediately come out and condemn the Russians, or they cannot come out and defend the Russians. They take an ambiguous position. They want to talk about NATO. But some of them might have to come out and say, we condemn the invasion. Now, other movements in Africa don't want that. They don't believe that Russia invaded Ukraine. They believe it was a defensive maneuver to hold off against an attack from NATO. They have a different perspective. So you got to trust other movements to take positions that are not identical to yours and build international unity based on trust, not based on an identical political line. This is a point that comes out of Ho Chi Minh's writings repeatedly, because people like Ho Chi Minh understood that in the struggle for national liberation, some movements are going to be much more focused on the national liberation part of the struggle, and others will be thinking about the social revolution and Marxism. And you cannot judge movements based on the different contexts and the class realities of where those movements are being built. They're going to have different levels of motion. I remember when I was a graduate student, I used to talk about levels. My postmodern professor used to try to savage me and say, oh, levels, so, whatever. And he used to also get angry when I talked about stages of the revolution. He'd say, there are no stages. And what I found funny is the term postmodern is a stagist concept. There was a modern and then there's a postmodern. So why are you getting upset with me for thinking about stages of economic development? That seems dumb to me. Like there's a million examples of economic development going in stages. People used to not use a water wheel, and they therefore had to go to the water source and put a bucket into a well and pull up and that was a certain level of productivity. Once you had a water wheel, productivity increases dramatically. Suddenly you're growing more food. There's more surplus. You're in a different stage of development. And you say, no, there's no stages. And I used to persist in saying, for you, it's a religion. Anti-so-called stagism, you're not making an argument to me. You're just telling me it's a wrong way to think. I found that so suffocating, when I was a student, that there were times when no arguments were held. You were just told that is forbidden. And I thought, why is Marxism forbidden? I submitted my first paper for a journal, and a famous English professor in England at Cambridge University read it, and he wrote in the comments that this is unreconstructed 1970s Marxism. And I thought that's hardly helpful, because in those days, people used to say comments should be helpful. But if you're going to savage a Marxist, you don't need to be helpful. You just tell them you're out of date, buddy. Get out of the door. We don't need you here. But Marxism always finds a way in. It keeps coming. You can't get rid of it because it's the adequate form of analyzing capitalism. It keeps coming back. You tell me what's a better way to analyze Marxism, I will absorb it. But I'm not going to abandon Marxism because somebody says it's out of date. I don't have a better way of grasping the essence and the logic of capitalism. So I'm waiting for somebody to give me another set of conceptual tools. I haven't seen it yet. And Marxism isn't what Marx wrote. It's a whole tradition. It's its development. Marxism constantly tries to absorb everything that's happening in the world. We are voracious. We want to read everything. We want to understand everything. We want to try to bring everything into the conjuncture. Give me another methodology that does that. I haven't seen it. I've seen tools of analysis, linguistic analysis. That's a tool of analysis. That's not a view of the world. Discourse analysis. That's a tool of analysis. It's not a view of the world. Ethnography. That's, again, a way to understand or get to methodology to grasp reality. It's not a view of the world. Give me a view of the world and I will abandon Marxism. Until you do it, it's here with me, and I hope some of you will take an interest in it and start trying to understand, well, what is this Marxism? Well, what we began to do is build this network around the world. And now there are about 400 social and political movements, landless workers in Brazil and in Tanzania, workers' parties in Tunisia. There's big political forces in Asia that are part of it. And we're really happy that Red Ant is part of a large and expanding network one way or the other. Because, we're still trying to figure out how to build this in a public setting. We spent 10 years doing everything, without publicity, because we needed for leaders to build trust with each other. We also have a theory of leadership. I'm not going to get into that. But leaders play an important role in movements. And leaders need to get to know each other, understand their traditions, and so on. And this is a very long and complex process, but we have a large number of movements in our network. In that meeting, they decided we need a research institute to better understand the world as it is. A factual-based assessment of the world. We can't go back and read, our teachers, Samir Amin and so on, and just implement Samir's thinking in the world today. Capitalism changes, imperialism changes. You have to have the knowledge of the now in order to understand how to build the best strategy for the now, how to create tactics for the now, and so on. So Tricontinental is the research institute of this network. It's a giant network. It makes our work very difficult because whenever we produce any knowledge, we have to go through the movements and discuss and figure out things and get frustrated and annoyed and angry. And if they're all late and they work hard and they don't have time to spend talking to you about things. But there's a reason why the movements are important for building knowledge. It's not a kind of populism. In the early days of our institute, we went back and we sort of read a bit randomly. One of the things that I remember plucking out was that great 11th thesis on Feuerbach by Marx, where Marx writes, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it." Now, I've always had a problem with that formulation. I think Marx wrote that in a hurry, or there's something wrong in his thinking. Because that formulation can be understood as anti-intellectualism. That, the philosophers have understood the world. The point, however, is to change it. So thinking is not that important. But obviously that couldn't have been Marx's meaning. Because if that were Marx's meaning, why did he spend so much time thinking? He read everything. He wrote thousands of pages. I mean, if he actually believed his 11th thesis and you interpret it in that anti-intellectual way, it makes no sense of Marx's life. So obviously that's a very bad reading of that thesis. So we came up with the best reading of the thesis, which I believe is actual meaning of thesis 11. So I encourage you to write this down because this is actually thesis 11, okay? Thesis 11, supplemental. Yeah? The thesis is, those who try to change the world understand it better. Those who try to change the world understand it better. What does that mean? You see, you can go into, let's say, the law school at an institution like this, and the lawyers will start telling you about human rights law, and you'll read one statute after the other. Yeah? And by the way, I'm exaggerating because I know this is not exactly, I used to teach at the law school. Where are my law school friends who were there where have you gone? There's you. No. You see, I used to teach at the Calcutta, the National Law School in Calcutta, and you studied in the National Law School in Jodhpur. These are a group of law schools around India. And I used to teach this. I know that what I'm saying is just not true, but just trying to make a point. But if you learn law through the lens, say, of absolute liberalism, and you learn, for instance, that you have democratic rights of dissent in a society, and you decide, hey, listen, we are at the University of Melbourne, and we're a little upset because the buses, the city bus, the service ends at 11 o'clock, but the library closes at midnight. So we would like the bus service to go till midnight. And you start a little protest movement and you think, we'll get a signature. You take it to the thing. Nobody pays attention. You do a little demonstration and they send the police and beat you. Suddenly, your liberal framework of law is a little bit clearer to you. Those who try to change the world have a better understanding of the limits of liberalism than those who just read the statute, where it says you can do all these things. Because we know there's a lot of things you can do, which you then cannot do. And those two things are not contradictory. It's not those things that are contradictory. It's a class interest embedded in society that produce contradictions around various kinds of thoughts. That's elementary Marxism. So if you approach Marx as having said, those who try to change the world understand it better, we believe then that if we did, say, a study of landless workers in Tanzania, let's do the study with MIWATA, the largest organization of landless workers in Tanzania. Let's go and spend time with them. Let's let them formulate the thesis for us. And then let's do what Gramsci says, is you take a movement's common sense and you elaborate it into philosophy. That's the work we do. And while we were developing our agenda, it became clear that our Marxism is a little idiosyncratic, that our tradition isn't the normal tradition. So I'm going to spend a few minutes distinguishing our Marxism from what is sometimes called Western Marxism, but I also want to contest that term because I think that term is not correct. Years ago, I read a book by Perry Anderson, which is a difficult task because when Perry Anderson writes anything, you need a dictionary. And you don't need a dictionary that's contemporary. You need a dictionary from the 1950s because he uses words that I've never even heard of, let alone, and they are for simple things like, somebody broke his leg. He'll have some fancy word for that. Why don't you just say somebody broke his leg? This is one thing I've never understood in that kind of writing. In a lot of academic prose, like there are some things that are pretty straightforward. Why put it into this sort of Byzantine thing that creates a gap between the people and understanding? I get jargon. Jargon is very important because it condenses ideas. Where you need to, you use a category. But why dress up the prose in a way that's completely alien from people? It's totally undemocratic. And Marxists should reject that form of writing. And when they introduce concepts, explain the concept as much as possible to bring in the reader, not to alienate people from thought. Our purpose isn't alienation, to actually deepen and further alienation and despair. Our purpose is to give people hope and the appreciation that they can make the world better. So I'm really big on this. And I once had a debate with some American scholars about this. They were like, oh, that's anti-intellectual. In fact, I don't think it's anti-intellectual. I think it's democratic. Because I actually believe there's a lot of times when you need to write at a level of abstraction that is not easy for those who haven't studied a certain mode of thinking to understand. Abstraction is very, very necessary at certain times, but not all the time. You don't have to write like that in the London Review of Books. I mean, for God's sake, it's meant to be a book review. Take it easy. Perry Anderson's book on Western Marxism need not have been written like that, but there's one section where he says that Western Marxism is built on defeat. That the defeat of the German Revolution of 1919 and then the subsequent defeat of the Hungarian Revolution made a kind of divide in the world of Marxism. And then he argues that Western Marxism goes into, an analysis of culture and so on. And I don't want to spend too much time with that. But I first want to just disagree with that characterization. But, he says basically that from, let's say, Gramsci onwards or Lukács onwards, right into the Frankfurt School and then into France, across, jumping over England, because he has no respect for English Marxism, as he demonstrates in a book called Arguments Within British Miami. He just thinks they're all empirical idiots. Perry Anderson is incredible. I mean, to have that sort of biblical judgment, he damns his own country to obsolescence, they are all empiricists, forget them. And he leaps to the United States where, it's another different kind of tradition, but it's basically those who take continental Marxism and elaborate it, from Frederick Jameson, etc., all the way to California. Now, the problem with this, there's at least two problems with this conceptualization of Western Marxism that we wanted to depart from. One, in all the surveys of Western Marxism, they go from Marx to somewhere near Gramsci and leap over Lenin. The absence of Lenin to me is very interesting in this tradition that they've constructed. There is no Lenin in it. Lenin doesn't appear. Somehow Gramsci appears, which to me is dismaying. So does Lukács, because both were communists. And the communism of Gramsci is taken away. What was Gramsci's project when he was in prison? Gramsci was not thinking in prison, it was a culture work. I'm going to found cultural studies. I'm going to write some notes and somebody in England is going to sort of read them. And they're going to be like, wow, let's study film and let's study football matches and whatever, the green cap that cricketers wear in Australia. What's the cultural significance of that? Gramsci wasn't thinking about that. Gramsci was saying in prison, why did the working class in Italy abandon the trade union movement, the Turin strikes, the Communist Party, and go to the fascists? Does it have something deeper in our society and culture? Is it something to do with the peasant cultures of Italy? The Southern question isn't about spatial dynamics. It's trying to understand the question of the peasantry, the centrality of the Italian peasantry, which is why it's such an appealing text for people outside Europe to read, which were peasant societies. So, what was the project of Gramsci? This gets erased in Western Marxism. The leap over Lenin, the abandonment of Lenin, means you can skip all the Leninist questions that motivate and are challenging in Gramsci. Gramsci is advancing a Leninist thinking of culture. But if you take out Lenin, then you can just say, well, he's interested in culture, and so on. Lukács is the same. You read History and Class Consciousness. It is an incredibly dense and difficult text. But by the way, it's firstly a set of collected essays. It's not a book. It's a set of collected essays. There's a little essay on Luxembourg, a little essay on Lenin. There's a long, brilliant essay where he basically goes into Kant and grounds Kant in the history of capitalism. It's just an extraordinary intellectual exercise that Lukács is in the middle of. While Lukács is writing this stuff, he's getting influenced by Bolshevism and Lenin. And then he writes that text on Lenin, which is great. And it's interesting. I remember taking a class on the Frankfurt School. We read History and Class Consciousness, but not his book on Lenin. And I asked the teacher, Moish Postone, trained in the whole tradition of the Frankfurt School, Moish, why are we not A, reading Lenin, and B, Lukács' writings about Lenin, and C, the amount of Leninist stuff in Gramsci? Why are you ignoring all that just to go to Horkheimer's inaugural lecture, which is effectively the conservatism of the Frankfurt School put together, where they are searching for a kind of Weberian, solution to Marxism? What is objectivity? Marx never bothered about objectivity. Marx understood that you need to enter a conjuncture, look at everything, build a picture, fight to establish a narrative. He didn't think, what's the objective way to write about the Paris Commune? That was not Marx's problem. That was Weber's problem. And that then becomes into Frankfurt School and dominates so much of Western Marxism, drawing people to paralysis. It opens the door to paralysis because you then start wondering, how do I write objectively? Do you know how you write objectively? By producing the best approximation of a narrative of the conjuncture that allows you to build strategy and tactics so you can influence the movement of history. That's what Marxism is. Marxism is not to worry about whether you can attain some kind of Abrahamic position on reality, where you can see all the truth. Or at least if you can't see all the truth, be self-reflexive about it. Come on. The only self-reflection necessary is to test your conjunctural analysis in the struggle. If it fails, you go back and try to make a better conjunctural analysis. That's Marxism. Marxism is what Gramsci called the philosophy of praxis. It's interesting. Gramsci calls it the philosophy of praxis. When I remember being taught Gramsci, I was told that, well, that's his code word for Marxism. That's not true. In the same text, in the prison notebooks, he uses the word Marxism. If he's used the word Marxism here, why would he have a code word here? Makes no sense to me. Because he's trying to explain Marxism. It's the philosophy of praxis. What does that mean? Praxis is not practice. It's not doing things. Praxis is the unity of theory and doing things. You build a theory, you try it out. If what you're doing as you try it out doesn't work, you recursively go back, build another better theory or worse theory. Try it out again. If it doesn't work, go back, build another better or worse. You build objectivity through praxis, not through self-reflexivity. That divide between what Western Marxism gets interested in, which is the problematic of self-reflexivity, is a Weberian problem. It's not a Marxist problem. In that sense, most of the Frankfurt School is actually Weberian. in their interests. They want to have a better way of understanding reality. That's not a Marxist position. A Marxist wants to intervene into the course of history to change things. That intervening is so key to Gramsci, but is taken out of Gramsci's oeuvre when people write about him. I've read almost all the biographies of Gramsci available in English, and they've all made him a toothless philosopher, which he was not. He was not a philosopher. He wasn't seeking to become a professor in Padua anywhere. He was in Mussolini's jail, not because of what he was writing, but because of his praxis, because he was a leader in the Communist Party of Italy. That's the one problem I had with this tradition that Anderson and others write about, Western Marxism. The other problem is that, in fact, a lot of Marxists in Europe and the United States are ignored in that tradition. And that is to say, almost all the people involved in the communist movement, even the Trotskyite movement and so on, are all set aside. Nobody reads them as Marxists of Europe. You know, they have not been systematized. Like Togliatti, for instance, the leader of the Italian Communist Party, has an enormous amount of writing and speaking on fascism. I mean, yes, he was influenced by Gramsci, and he made several tactical mistakes as the chairperson of the Communist Party of Italy. But during World War II, during the fascist era, he gave these lectures in Moscow to Italian communists in exile, it's published as Lectures on Fascism, where Togliatti talks about the importance of the left entering football clubs, entering movie screenings, start screening movies in little villages. In other words, the cultural aspect of hegemony was very important to Togliatti, and that's precisely what the PCI did when the above ground period happened, and it's why they became the most influential party in Italy for 2 decades before they killed themselves off in the 1990s, but that's another story. So this second objection, I think, is pretty real. There's a lot of people who just don't get read. Now, bear with me on this, because I've been a member of a party for 35 years. I know that often the quality of writing by people who are active in these movements is not great. You know, they are on a bus somewhere, they've just addressed a rally in some rural place, they are, on the way to somewhere else for 20 organizational meetings, they have a notebook. This is a habit which will never leave me, the notebook habit. When you're on an Indian bus, for instance, going from one thing to another, you have a notebook and you write some squiggly notes in the darkness going over an overnight bus. Next day you arrive there, you try to type up your notes which you can't read, you send it to the newspaper, it's not exactly, no time to edit it. The quality is not great. Don't get stopped by the quality. We're looking at the ideas. What is the content there? It's the role of the Marxist intellectual to, as Gramsci says, take the common sense, elaborate it into philosophy. Take the writings of people who are involved in the thick of political movements. Don't dismiss them in an elitist way and say this is really badly written, stupidly put together, there's mistakes here and there. Try to find what the argument is and lift the arguments up. That was never done for decades by scholars in the West. Never done. People just didn't take them seriously. It's that second methodological point that governed our work in Tricontinental. Because what we decided to do was a publication agenda of, for instance, taking the works of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was an extraordinary man, born in the Gold Coast under British colonial rule, developed as a teacher, because he's a very bright person. As a teacher, he developed a strong feeling against colonialism, very strong feeling. He is able to get a scholarship to go to the United States to study at Lincoln University. On the way in 1936, he stops in London. He's walking down the street. He sees a newspaper headline that says, Italy invades Ethiopia. And he's outraged. And he says, that is the moment when I knew that I must fight against the scourge of colonialism. Goes to the United States, meets a number of other African leaders, comes back to England, 1945, helps organize the Pan-African meeting, the 5th Pan-African Congress, then comes back to the Gold Coast, gets himself a little car and drives all over to every village talking to people about how they felt about the situation. As he talked to people in one village, he took their thinking to the next village. He heard from a second village, accumulated the two knowledges to the third, and he built up his own understanding of the general sensibility of the people of the Gold Coast. He built a sense of the conjuncture. And what does a Marxist do? He starts a newspaper where he begins to write sometimes in his name, but he begins to write not ideology. He doesn't shove ideology down people's throat. He tries to reflect in the paper on what he's hearing, so that people who take the newspaper in far-flung villages will essentially read their own ideas. It's a very important part of the building of national liberation Marxism, because in a society where literacy rates are low, and that can be interpreted in many ways, you have to build the sensibility of a people into a kind of narrative. And that's what Nkrumah does. His speeches that he gives, which we have some of the newspaper articles. As you know, I edited a book on the revolutionary thoughts of Kwame Nkrumah. That's part of this research project we have at Tricontinental, trying to put together the thoughts of somebody like Nkrumah and position him for what he is, which is a Marxist intellectual. You see, before I go ahead, I just want to make a parenthesis. It's very interesting when people think of Che Guevara or Ho Chi Minh or even Nkrumah, they think of them as doers. You know, all the thought happens in Europe, and all the African, Asian, Latin Americans are doers. They make revolution. But the thinkers are in Europe. I mean, it's extraordinary that in the world of Marxism, this is so casually replicated. So you'll have books on like best Marxists of the 21st century, and they're like David Harvey. There's just all white guys, maybe one or two women, but there's nobody from the South. You know, they just don't exist. Even now, you know, if there are classes on Marxism, I guarantee you, the syllabus will be extraordinary global South free. You know, because Ho Chi Minh is just a guy who did a revolution. That's all he did. He just did a revolution. Fidel Castro just did a revolution. That's what he did. They didn't think. They just did. Amilcar Cabral just did. Thomas Sankara just did. But in fact, these are our Marxists. They did and they won. Adorno didn't win a damn thing. Not as far as I know. But you'll have a whole seminar on Adorno. You'll have silence on Cabral. Cabral is one of the most sophisticated thinkers from the African continent. I doubt that anybody who teaches Marxism puts Cabral at the center. They may say, well, he's not a Marxist, he's in for natural liberation. See, that's an interesting phenomena. I've had this debate as well with people. They say, well, it's not really a Marxist. What makes a Marxist? Somebody who writes a treatise on Marx? That's not Marxism. That's Marxology. That's a study of Marx's writings. Marxists aren't obsessed with what Marx said. I'm not religious. I don't care what Marx said. Marx can be wrong. I'm a Marxist. Marx is wrong on a lot of things. Sometimes Marx's formulations are offensive. I don't treat him like a god. I'm a Marxist. But I'm not a Marxologist. I don't pray to Marx. Although I must say I do have a statue of Marx in my house. But it's a statue from rural West Bengal, and he kind of looks like a Bengali Marx. Just as Lenin, looks, as you go to different countries, Lenin began to look more and more Chinese. But this is a curiosity, this idea that these are not thinkers. Nkrumah thought hard. What did he think about? The moment he wins independence for Ghana, he starts a formulation that is so interesting. He starts to say, we have won independence for Ghana, but not for Africa. His concept is Africa must unite, African unity. Not Pan-Africanism, but African unity. It's because of Nkrumah and that theory of African unity so central to the Marxist project that the African Union was created, first as the Organization of African States in 1963. While Nkrumah is trying to build a society of sovereignty in Ghana, he sits in his office in Accra and starts and drafts a book, which is one of the most outstanding books on the neocolonial project. It's called Neocolonialism, published in 1965 while he is the president of Ghana. It's a Marxist account of the underdevelopment of Africa. It is an extraordinary book. It is the only book reviewed by the CIA. They had a long review of it, which they sent to all department heads. And it's the only book I know of that forced the US government to coup somebody. Because in a statement regarding the coup, in a now declassified archive, you can read about them saying that book is dangerous. But nobody reads Neocolonialism, the last stage of capitalism. It's not read. It's mostly out of print. We are going to bring out all of Nkrumah's writing. Nkrumah is a Marxist. Thomas Sankara comes to power through a military coup in 1983. People say, oh, military coup. That's not the way Marxism works. Maybe not in Germany, where you've built such a great Marxist revolution. But in Upper Volta, the only way to take power was through a military coup. And what did Sankara do with that? He thought deeply about how do you advance the needs of people around issues of food sovereignty and how hunger must be overcome. That's in 1983, long before the term food sovereignty becomes popular among NGOs. He's thinking about it. He says, he who feeds you controls you. That's one of his great lines. He who feeds you controls you. Feed yourself. He takes that ridiculous colonial name, Upper Volta, throws it out of the window, changes the name of his country to Burkina Faso, land of upright people. He says, we are Burkinabe. We are not Upper Volta. That's a colonial name. This is decolonial before decolonial decided to take Marxism out of anti-colonialism. Burkina Faso, food sovereignty. That was Thomas Sankara. He was a much more sophisticated Marxist, trying to develop a theory of the conjuncture in 1983. And what did they do with him? They killed him in 1987, couped him. Marxists in the third world get killed, couped, put in jail, or not allowed to go to their countries or whatever. Marxists don't get university degrees. It's your job to read these Marxists seriously, dig a hole through their theory, building an understanding of their methodology, and then not import them directly into Australia, as if you can just bring Ho Chi Minh and say, let's follow Ho Chi Minh in Australia. It's ridiculous. You have to do what they did. Build a conjunctural analysis of the situation in Australia. Learn from the different traditions, cultures, customs in Australia. What are the resources of hope? Jose Carlos Mariátegui, one of the great Leninists of Latin America. In 1928, having been to Europe before then, read Gramsci, read Lenin deeply. Jose Carlos Mariátegui comes back to Peru. 1928, he writes an extraordinary book, 7 Interpretive Essays of Peruvian Reality. Such a boring title. One of the best Marxist books in South America. Because what Mariátegui says is that before colonialism, before the Inca Empire, we had a pre-Incan communism in the Andes. We need to study that. And then against indigenismo, because he writes against indigenismo, Mariátegui says, we don't want to go back to the past. The past is not a destination. We don't want to return to the past. The past is a resource. We take the past to build the future. We want to build a world for the indigenous people of the Andes. That is a world in the modern. The people of the Andes shouldn't be treated like zoological specimen, that you go there for tourism, take pictures and say, look how cute the natives look. People are not animals like that for a zoo. They also want to change their lives. Where is the space for that? Mariátegui thinks about that a lot. It's 1928, one of the great Marxists, totally outside these reading lists, outside this tradition. This is national liberation Marxism. It is a vital tradition that has tried to change the world and in some cases has succeeded. The most important place of success, two most important. One was Vietnam in 1945. What an incredible revolution. I spent almost 15 years collecting the writings of Ho Chi Minh. Much of it never been translated from Viet before, including his study notes on revolution when he was teaching in China in the 1920s. From Ho Chi Minh, there is so much to be learned. I mean, I read the Verso edition, some essays of Ho Chi Minh, and in the introduction, a friend of mine writes that Ho Chi Minh was a revolutionary but not a theorist. You know, that casual sort of dismissal. And I thought, really, because in his writings, and even at that time already available in English, Ho Chi Minh has a formulation that is extremely useful. It's like the last writings of Lenin, better, fewer than better, better, fewer, but better, was one of his last texts, speeches he gives to the peasant cooperatives, right in the last few months of his life. Lenin is worried about what happens once you take power in a poor country. What happens when you take power in a poor country, the Tsarist Empire, poor country, battered by war, starvation, and so on. Ho Chi Minh was worrying about the same thing. What happens when you take over? The French leave, the Americans initially leave with the French, come back, like Americans always do. They leave. And the Australians also come back, by the way, and bomb the hell out of Vietnam. I learned the other day from reading Clinton Fernandez, tremendous scholar of Australia's ugly history, that Australian bombers provided flight. They flew alongside US bombers to provide security. They flanked the US bombers as the US bombers bombed the dams in the northern part of Korea and flooded the paddy fields. And what's interesting about that, just by the way, and those were Australian aircraft that provided air cover. What's interesting about that is that was in 1951-52. In 1946-47 at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Tribunal hung a Nazi official who blew up the dikes in the Low Countries in Netherlands. So what the Nazis had done just a few years before, for which a Nazi general was hung, the United States and Australia did against the Korean people. It's a great crime that this country has never paid for. This country's acts in Vietnam, in the Malayan emergency, forget, of course, the genocide against original, the First Nations and so on. So many crimes that have never been paid for that are worth considering, Yeah, and so when I come to the next example of China, think about that, because some of you will already start thinking, well, China is such a horrible place, but Australia is great. And so when I come to that, Ho Chi Minh is worrying like Lenin is worrying. What happens when you take over a country where it's poor and the people just don't have the resources to become state officials? And so he comes up with a formulation that's so interesting. It's patriotic emulation. You got to teach people. It's a subjective issue, not objective. It's a poor country. You're going to have to leapfrog over poverty. And you got to develop the productive forces. There's no other way. You made a revolution in a country which is in the realm of necessity. The productive forces are at a low level of development. What are you going to tell the Vietnamese communists? Wait a minute, guys. The productive forces aren't developed enough. Surrender power to the bourgeoisie so that they can build up the productive. We'll wait till they're, sufficiently developed. And Marxism is not mechanical. They took power. You have to build the productive force. In order for that, you have to move to the subjective side of history. You have to train people to be state officials who follow a theory of patriotic emulation, where they will emulate, copy others like Ho Chi Minh, their character, not want to rob from the people, not want to line their own pockets, not treat the people without dignity. This is a Marxist theory. This is a theory of how the state should operate. Lenin, in his last years, people read State and Revolution, but that's written at the beginning. He hasn't experienced statecraft yet. You read his last text, he's desperate. He says, we don't know how to run the state. We don't have enough qualified people. And people are going to start stealing because it's a poor country. So there the subjective side Marxism has to toggle between the actual movement of history, the material side, and the subjective side. There we have to actually theorize what does it mean subjectively in a revolutionary situation. How do you create a new personality? Ho Chi Minh theorizes that deeply. This is also something that worried Mao Zedong during the Long March. You remember, he writes these rules. If you take a chicken, pay for it. That's not just a dumb statement. What he's telling the soldiers is, you got to have patriotic emulation. You got to behave with dignity. You can't cheat the people. This is a Marxist theory. This is not just rules for guerrilla warfare, as they're sometimes treated. It's about how you have an attitude between the state and the people, the party and the people, an organized force and the people, etc. Whatever the nature of the organized force. China is an interesting place to read theory because generally people read Mao. But Mao died in 1976. That was a long time ago. And I've been very interested in the last few years, and our institute very interested in bringing out debates among Marxists in China today. So we started publishing, I think 2 years ago, a journal called Wenhua Zhongheng, which is, we publish the international issue. It's a famous magazine in China. We do the international issue in English, Portuguese, Spanish, and a few other languages. We choose and curate debates between and amongst Chinese Marxists today about issues like what should China's relationship be to the African continent? That's one of the issues we have. What is green economy? What is a zero carbon development strategy? That issue will come out next month. We have an issue coming out next year. What is socialism? What are Chinese intellectuals, Marxists saying about that? Let's read Chinese theory. And here's the interesting thing. When you enter the theoretical world of another culture, you realize that the mode of theorizing is different. When I first learned Spanish, or struggled to learn Spanish, I realized that Spanish theorization is not self-identical to Anglo-Saxon theorization. Anglo-Saxons think in a linear way. This is the argument I want to make. These are the elementary empirical things, and here's the conclusion. But in the world of Spanish and to some extent French letters, it's much more circular. You're thinking in a different way, spiral maybe. Those who have read Foucault, for instance, he's the best exemplar of nonlinear thinking. Foucault is going here and then 3 pages, I'm not saying this, I'm not saying that, I'm not saying this, and then you're an Anglo-Saxon reader going, what the hell are you saying, man? Why don't you just put it in bullet points? Prisons are bad. Prisoners don't know that they're in prison. But he is trying to create a world for you. I don't agree with most of what Foucault has written, but I thought his style of argumentation was delicious. It was a completely different way of seeing an argument. Yeah? So Chinese methodology of argumentation is different. And, I don't feel compelled to apologize and say, oh, it's not Orientalism if I say that. It's a different cultural mode of theorization. That's just what it is. And so it's very interesting to translate these texts into English because we want to bring some of the form of theorization into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. It's a huge challenge, but we want to do that as an institute. National Liberation Marxism. It's a little bit of a journey that we all could take together. I want to welcome you into the journey. I want to ask you to read some of these people. I want to ask you to read them like you read the theorists of the Frankfurt School and so on, the books published by Verso. You read those with a pen, underline large sections, try to figure out what they're saying. Read Ho Chi Minh like that. Give him a break. He was writing in a jungle. He was fiddling with his American cigarettes, which he loved smoking. He said, the only thing I like about America is the cigarettes. He was getting bombed while he was thinking. But don't treat his writing as quote unquote lesser because of the context of his production. Think about it as more. much deeper, much harder, much more important. Thanks a lot.
Vijay. Oh, thank you. We have.
Okay.
We have, I think, this room until 5. So basically, we can go until you run out of energy, which I'm astounded that you haven't as yet. And we can take as many questions as you want. But I want to say, I guess, it makes me feel really sad that Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Mariategi, all these guys, Ho Chi Minh, I have never been in a room at UniMel where people have ever talked about this. And that just feels awful. It really does. But it also feels wonderful that we can have this opportunity to hopefully be able to, I guess, rejig the intellectual culture of all these intellectuals here at UniMel. So just thank you so much for bringing up the hurt.
Yeah, please. I mean, you've given me a lot of time to get grilled, so grill me. Before I arrived in New Zealand first, a letter came out with all kinds of formulations about my ideas, saying I was a genocide denier and so on. But the best was that some of the stuff people were saying about me, I didn't even know. I thought, this is amazing. I had to research some of the things. Like, I am that? That's fascinating. So yeah, anyway, sorry. That was unnecessary. Please. We treat it as it should be treated. We rethink what he's trying to say. We junk things that are bad. We dismiss him for, something sexist that he would say, etc. I mean, Engels is the much more interesting character on this because The Origin of the Family is an incredible book. I mean, he provides, in a sense, a grounding for the patriarchal family. But to do that, he uses some of the most racist anthropologists like Morgan and others. So now what do? Engels was trying to say something quite brilliant, which is that the European patriarchal family is not the natural family. And he was saying anthropologists have found all these other family, ways of having families. So he then reads the anthropologists. He doesn't travel to PNG and so on. He uses anthropologists. Some of them are actually pretty good. They're not all racist, but some are. And then he argues that the form of the patriarchal family in Europe is produced by a certain property relation. I mean, it's a great book. It's, in a sense, timeless. But it's also cringy to read his descriptions from the anthropologists. So in that sense, I always tell people you have to read in a mature way. Like, I'll tell you, I love Edward Said. He's one of the most important people. His Lifting the Flag of Palestine is incredible. His book, The Question of Palestine, Covering Islam, those are incredible. But there's sections of Orientalism which I found nitpicky. He wasn't going in and asking, what is this thinker trying to do? He says, well, look, that's anachronistic. To pick out a paragraph and somebody uses a word that's no longer O Quran. And then he says, well, we cancel this person. I mean, try to understand what they're trying to do. I think Engels' Origin of the Family is a perfect text for exactly what you're saying. It really is cringy, but it's brilliant. How can it be? Because we are mature readers. And teachers have to be mature teachers. They have to say, go in and get the best out of it. Not like the gotcha kind of, thing where, hey, I found something wrong in that text, let's dismiss this text. That attitude to reading is really bad. It's super shallow and strikes me as a kind of, graduate schooly sort of one-upmanship. Education is about doing the best you can, not looking for flaws, yeah? Yes, sir.
As I understand it, Marxism is about high equality, that is, they hate inequality. But I was talking to you before, inequality arises due to differences in talent. As I said before, it's not normally distributed, it is not normally distributed, which means due to the difference in talent, which could be 1,000 times more, there's going to be inequality. That happens in every animal in nature, not just humans. So isn't Marxism going against nature?
Yeah, it's a very interesting problem and question you raised. But the thing is, it really depends what you mean by equality. You know, nobody really can imagine a society where everybody's identical. Things are going to be strange. We have different talents that we bring to the table. And I don't think we really have a good formulation of what that ultimate society will look like, because in a sense, the ultimate society always produces the next ultimate, because the contradictions will keep making us strive to something different. We're always going to be engaged in a struggle. I mean, the question isn't, can we get there? But the question is, where are we going now? So, for instance, when the Chinese Revolution happens, I mean, we can make a direct line from 1949 to now and say these are all the bad things that happened. But if you understand history as going in a straight line upward, progressive, then you can say, well, it failed here, it failed here. But if you understand history, as I think a Marxist should, which is that history moves in zigs and zags based on the tempo of the class struggle, that you'll have advances, you're humans, you'll make errors, there'll be collapses, disastrous things. Because if you're, as Lenin once said, if you're not willing to make a mistake, you'll do nothing. So you're going to make mistakes. That's inevitable. That's baked in the cake of trying to build a better society. I'm not sure our better society is mathematical equality. I think we want to build a better society, but I don't think we really understand fully what that society's relationship to, say, talents and nature is going to look like. I mean, we have a society now where the relationship of talent to wealth is not commensurate. I mean, Elon Musk is an idiot, but he was born into a family with apartheid wealth in South Africa. His life chances at birth in apartheid South Africa were already higher than, say, a young man, black man born down the street from him in South Africa. So that's already, their talents were irrelevant. So we want to build a society that at least doesn't continually reward wealth and reward the children of wealth. So I agree with you. These are compelling, difficult debates. But it's premature to have the debate now, because we're nowhere near mathematical equality to start thinking about what will happen then. It could very well be that we'll get to a point where we'll realize that there are different forms of talent and people contribute to the general social labor differently. And maybe we should change our understanding of what talent is. Why is certain things talent and certain things not? Yeah, so that, for instance, somebody knows very well how to manage a field and make sure environmental degradation doesn't happen. That's a very great talent. But we may consider the person who can recite a book, memorize a Quran, to be more talented than that person. So these are all going to be arguments. Talent is not natural. Talent is also social, because we decide how to hierarchize different talents, different needs. But it's a premature conversation. I mean, we're so far from that conversation. I wish we were nearer. Yeah. Talent may be its own reward. I mean, these are all nice things, but really we are far from that. Anything else? Very good question. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I have traveled in the Sahel quite a bit. I've reported from there. In fact, did the crazy thing of the Sahara crossing to Sabah, Libya, which is nuts. And I've written a lot about the alliance of Sahel states. there was a conference earlier this year of economists from the three states of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. You know, many years ago, I interviewed Alpha Omar Konaré, who was the president of Mali. This was during the time when Bill Clinton was the president of the US. Omar Konaré used to be a Marxist. And then at the fall of the Soviet Union, his political tendency basically went into a kind of social democratic liberalism, which was great at the time, necessary. And Konaré created a great agenda. He said that if Mali could get the odious debt forgiven, the debt was odious because the dictatorship took a lot of it. Why did the Western bondholders lend to a dictatorship? Yeah, it's their fault. They should get penalized for that. So he went and he said, I want a major haircut on the debt so that I can use some of Mali's quite considerable resources, gold sales and so on, to settle the dispute with the Tuareg in the north and with the various herders in the middle, the Fulani and others. That was his vision. When he went to the bondholders and said this, the US government State Department Africa desk and people like Anthony Lake said that, no, you need to fulfill your obligations. You have to pay the Western creditors first before you can. So then Konaré just couldn't do anything, lost power. From the 1990s, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, all these countries, the entire political class was basically eclipsed by orders from Paris. They all signed up to the G5 Sahel agenda. They basically welcomed border control for Europe at the Sahel region. And they were angry, the people, when the United States and France destroyed Libya in 2011. And then all the Al-Qaeda and cigarette smugglers and all of that just created mayhem in the northern part of Burkina Faso, Mali, and then very large parts of Niger, particularly in western Niger. So the militaries were paralyzed. Now you got to understand, these are societies where there's no political parties of any liberal or left orientation any longer. They are basically the parties of the establishment that are effectively pro-French parties. There's no political space. So lots of young people, because there's no other opportunity, join the military. And in the military, they became Sankaraists. So Ibrahim Traoré, for instance, dresses like Sankara. He speaks like, his intonation is totally Thomas Sankara. They basically are people who want to establish the sovereignty of their countries. They want the French out. They want the French to stop exploiting their mines. And then the United States, scared by this, started accusing them of being pro-Russian. You see, because Africans are a lower people, and Africans cannot be independent. If the French are not dominating them, it must be the Russians. And that's such a racist way of seeing the world. So nobody is willing to accept that Ibrahim Traoré is being led by himself. He must have a Russian sitting behind him. Some white guy has to be there to teach an African how to talk. Such a racist approach that works, because then people say, wow, the Wagner group is there. What evidence is there? The Wagner group is, it's boogeyman politics. So I think there's an agenda. I don't know exactly where it'll go. Please.
Thank you so much. I really compared your comments about Australian complicity in imperialism, especially in this region. I have a question about Frank Fanon, arguably the only third world Marxist that does get read commonly on the group. And just, your thoughts about, is it sort of a, does he get used as kind of a stand-in for all the rest?
Great. So I went to graduate school in the worst decade to enter the academy, which was the late 80s, when, the tidal wave of postmodernism was basically washing everything out of the door. And it was relatively illegal. Seriously, like my fellowship my advisor told me, just go to do your ethnography, leave your campus. Then I became a research scholar in Delhi University. There was one Marxist there, Randir Singh. Ranveer Singh also told me, don't come to any seminars. Just go to rural Punjab, start learning things, just start writing. Don't try to talk to anybody. Do like a secret PhD. It was really good advice. But you may remember that time, Fanon made a comeback through an edition produced with an introduction, Black Skin, White Mask by Homi Bhabha, where they basically took Fanon and did to Fanon what they had done to Gramsci earlier, which is Fanon became a theorist of race. And Fanon became a theorist of racial binaries. That section in Black Skin, White Mask, where he's a boy walking and somebody hails him and says, you are a black boy. And he says to his mother, what is that? Because he's not familiar. And he says, race is what you are called. But he's making a specific point. If you read Homi Bhabha's introduction, it's a universal law. Racism, in fact, is about interpersonal relations. The structure of racism constructed so beautifully in chapter 1 of The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about, of all words to use for me, spatial dynamics. In the native part of town, there is no water. In the white part of town, they have fountains. They have roads that are clean. They have schools that are the envy of the native. And so that beautiful lyrical binary that he writes about there is about the structures of colonial racism. But what gets envisioned as Fanon, and then I'm sorry to say, even in Isaac Julian's documentary, is Fanon as the theorist of race. Why? Because they are thinking about race in the metropole. And Fanon, who only dies at the age of 36, was rapidly moving into the world of colonialism. It's in The Wretched of the Earth that he writes, I have slightly stretched Marxism. He doesn't talk about Marxism in his early writings. You know, that first text is his scream at the French Academy that doesn't permit him to get a degree. So he writes White Skin, Black Mask as a scream. It's a fantastic surrealist text. But the essence of his oeuvre cannot be his early work, it must be his later work and his essays on Algerian liberation movement. If you look at the theoretical assessments of Fanon, it's always the early work. It's very rarely Fanon on the veil. If it's that, it's Fanon on the veil as an allegory of the racial binary. What about Fanon on the anti-colonial radio? You know, all of that Fanon that leads to The Wretched of the Earth, the glorious book, which is super misread because it's read through the white philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre who writes the foreword. Because Fanon is not saying that violence is cleansing. Fanon is saying that the structure of violence you imposed on the colonized is going to force the colonized to fight back with violence. But not that violence itself, he's not fetishizing violence. He's talking about the relationship of colonizer and colonized. Superb for the situation in Gaza. And I was surprised to see that both Lewis Gordon and Adam Schatz, who's got a new biography of Fanon, both said that Fanon would side with the Israelis in this conflict. That is the state of Fanon studies. That is the state of Fanon studies. Because they've taken out the colonizer-colonized relationship as, in my mind, the essence of Fanon's objective. He's interested in that, conveying that. If you take that out, he is an Israeli. Stunning. Somebody there, yes, please.
I guess I was curious because you mentioned that neocolonialism is like underread, but also is like out of reach a lot of spaces. So I'm like wondering if you could talk to like the relationship between like both the sort of just like not being put on this, but also just like not being reproduced in the like publishing sort of sense.
Okay, there's a tape running here, so I'm a little conscious of that. But I would like to say this, and it might be interesting to you. Many years ago, the family of Walter Rodney, who was really one of the great Marxists, I didn't mention him today, but I was not exhaustive. I was mainly laying out the principles. Walter Rodney's family asked me, they wanted to reproduce his books in a nice editions and so on. So I was very much interested in that. And they were keen on having a Western publisher. So I introduced them to Verso Books, and eventually Verso said yes. I didn't have any control over the process. I just merely introduced them to Verso. It's very interesting. I participated in one book, which was Rodney's lectures on the Russian Revolution. I wrote the foreword to that. I didn't see the rest of the book till it was published. I would have taken objection with the introduction to that book. Then there was introductions to some of Rodney's other work. Now, it was interesting. One of Rodney's closest associates in Tanzania, who had helped him with the book, was asked initially to write the introduction. After he had done a very good introduction, the press decided, no, they wanted a big name, so they asked Angela Davis and shunted him aside. So this is really frustrating, how things do get put out there. Yeah? I'm now in a project of getting the Nkrumah writings republished. There was a problem because Nkrumah gave the rights to PanAf Press in London. PanAf stands for Pan-African. They were friends of his. He gave them the rights. It's hard to get rights to these books, which I believe are the universal inheritance. So we initially put together this collection from Inkani Books in South Africa, which I'm part of the collective in that publishing venture called Revolutionary Thoughts of Kwame Nkrumah. So we controlled the process, talked to the three children, and Francis Nkrumah, who sadly died this year, wrote the foreword to that book. He was the eldest son of Kwame Nkrumah was Francis Kwame Nkrumah, and his son's name was Francis. So, I mean, I would like to publish all of these books, but it costs money, and we are not a publishing house that is just swimming in a lot of cash. So there are practical issues involved. And plus, if I make a book, you'll criticize me and say, why is it so expensive? I know you. I know you'll send me an email. It'll be the first email I'll get, right? How come this is so expensive? You support the revolution, put it online for free. Look, it's going to be online for free anyway. I don't care. But we are printing a book. It's paper involved. People work to edit it and, all of that. Somehow we have to get it going. So I really want to do a big publishing thing. From Leftward in India, we published Selected Ho Chi Minh. Took me almost 20 years to make that book. Things had to be translated from Viet. It was a complicated book, okay? Not easy to do. We've published Sankara. We've published Cabral. This is Cabral's 100th year. 1804 Books in New York, with which we work, is publishing a new edition of Cabral's lectures, effectively on how to make a revolution. I'm looking forward to it. I wrote the introduction. I want you to get a hold of it. Yeah, there are lots of Cabral books out there that are really good, including the edition from Monthly Review called Tell No Lies, which has his Tricontinental speech. You can get it online. Most of this stuff is online. Build your own book.
Yeah, I'm so curious about the publication.
No, it's difficult, my friend. Rights are complicated. Also, people who own the rights don't trust, to be honest with you, despite the fact who they were, Nkrumah and so on. They would prefer to get a publisher in London or New York. We are in Delhi, Johannesburg. I mean, what can I do? I need a publisher in Australia. Distribute our books here. Not available. I go to the bookstores in New Zealand, Unity Books. I've been in here. All your books come from London and from New York. I walk through the bookshelf. All the history books are either produced by your university press or London, New York. Where are your books from? English books from Africa, from rest of Asia. Nobody cares to buy it, to import it. Where's the
Pacific, like regionally? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. I don't have a solution for you. But I know you. You will be the first to tell me it's too expensive. Just steal the books and put it online. We don't care. We prefer people read, than like, right? I'm happy to send you the PDFs. Circulate it to your friends.
We might take one or two more questions.
I thought you had a long time. Okay, yeah. People are happy. I'll let them ask questions. Yeah.
You can help. Yeah.
I don't know. It's your red shirt and then green shirt and then my friend Babu in the back. Yeah. And then please.
So just nice to have a regrounding Marxism in the space, I think. I had a question about your thoughts on kind of settler colonialism as a framework, because I think it's a dominant way of kind of understanding colonialism in this country. And talking about imperialism is something that you hear less commonly on the left, as well as kind of more broadly. So yeah, I wondered whether you find that framework useful, how, if at all, it can be combined with an understanding of imperialism in the global sense, and who, if anyone, has done that in a way that you find kind of informative.
There was an Australian that I met in Ramallah. He died as soon as he came back here. Patrick Wolf.
Oh.
We had this conversation one night in Ramallah. We were walking from the Edward Said Hall down to where we were staying. I really liked it. Then he came back home and died. I thought I better not talk to people anymore. He was a lovely guy. Do people read him? He was a tremendous guy. But we discussed this a lot. I'm scared of giving my honest answer. Particularly, you have a Palestine shirt on and...
But there's interesting writing from Palestine on this issue. So
yeah.
I'll
give you my honest answer. It's a strange way. I've been thinking a lot about this since I remember this Patrick Wolf, because he had given a presentation, settler colonial, and I'd asked him afterwards, what is the political objective of this framework? So, for instance, somebody in New Zealand came to me after a talk and said, you don't talk about Chinese colonialism of the Uyghur lands, the Hans coming in and so on. So I asked him, where's your family from? He said, from England. So I said to him, why don't you go home? Why don't you go home then? You are opposed to people coming to other countries. You should go home. Do we want to build a planet of Israels or plurinational states? Seems to me that's the choice we have as humans. Do we want Israels or plurinational? I want plurinational states. I don't want a planet of Israels. Planet of Israels is objectionable to me. The framework of settler colonialism sometimes suggests that the settler should leave. Now, this, in some particular cases, might be appropriate. Like, for instance, in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia at the time, when the national liberation struggle was going on, it was very clear that the English that were there saw themselves as English and were never going to become Zimbabweans. They were never going to be Zimbabweans. That's a question that the South African population had to deal with. Are you going to be South African? Equal South Africans? So the question of settler colonialism isn't just a framework. It's also what outcome are you thinking about? So in Palestine, it's a curious business because I don't think the term settler colonialism applies. I think you have a multiplicity of populations. You have a group that is attempting to build a supremacist state, and that supremacist state must be destroyed. And that you need to create a multiplicity of people in the land. That's the Bolivian plurinational project. So I'm not sure if settler colonial as a framework is helpful. Because settler colonial means that then the settler should go home. Can we have a better framework? Imperialist framework works fine for me. But so does the supremacist ethno-nationalist state, which is an accurate representation of Israel. Israel as a state project is not settler colonial. It's a Jewish supremacist ethno-nationalist state project which should be destroyed. That's what I believe. So that's the argument I had with Patrick Wolf. And he was adamant, that the settler colonial, and everybody in the seminar was with him. I was the outlier. Even though everybody believed in the one-state solution, which I thought was curious. How do you adopt a settler colonial framework and then you believe in the one-state solution? I was in a strange position of making a kind of argument about imperialism and saying that in a transitional way, you might have to create the two-state solution in order to advance towards the one-state, the stagism thinking. And that drove all of them crazy because they said, how can you have a two-state solution? But they were for a one-state solution, and what? The settlers then remain. So it'll always be settler colonial. That's permanent settler colonial if you go by the logic of the outcome of the theory. So that's my answer. But I think it's a really controversially weird answer. It may not help you at all. Okay, the green shirt, then we go up there. Sorry, two more up there. Yeah.
Thinking about other Marxists, have you come across Communist Party? Yeah. Think about?
Well, there are, if you talk to the people in Red Ant, many of them are actually extremely well versed in this particular question. So what I would recommend is after we finish, you can go to the table and you can talk to Nick and Pipin and I don't know who all are there. They can help you. I don't want to speak for them. I really don't know Indonesia like they do. Yeah? So they are the best. Babu, yeah.
I was just, because you had this grand esquisse of what's happening all over, from history to now, and you mentioned Gramsci and the others. I wonder if M.N. Roy was of any curiosity for you. He was in Mexico, he was in China, he was in Russia, he came back to India, and he said, I'm a Marxist, but with a difference. I'm not class war, but ideas. To use postmodern language, where would you locate him?
Well, firstly, there's a bar in Mexico City called M.N. Roy. I mean, he's an incredible guy because he was born in Bengal, where I was born, much later than him. He was not only the founder of the Mexican Communist Party, but at the second Comintern, he had a famous debate with Lenin on the question of how Marxists deal with nations or national liberation. In fact, Lenin was more a national liberation Marxist than Roy in that debate, because Roy was more class against class, build the working class movement to overthrow the Indian bourgeoisie and so on. It's a fascinating debate. But they came to a very interesting synthesis of their disagreement in the resolution. And then Roy, of course, becomes the founder of the Indian Communist Party in Tashkent, in the USSR. The Indian Communist Party has an interesting origin. It's in USSR that it's founded, in Tashkent, but it's actually also founded in Stockton, California, in 1913, 7 years before, as the Gadar Party, the Revolt Party. And a lot of those Gadar Babas become part of the stream into the Indian Communist movement. I always like to think of these as the two kind of parallel origins of the Indian Communist movement. The first Congress in India is 1925. Roy plays an enormous role in going around the country illegally, meeting people like Muzaffar Ahmad in Calcutta, or then Singravelu in Madras, and bringing all these different people together, plays a great role. Later in life, he comes to a position called humanism, or rather, what was the full name? Radical Humanism. He has a journal called Radical Humanism, and so on. I mean, he is an interesting character, but from India, there are so many. The much more useful character, in my opinion, or figure as a Marxist is E.M.S. Namboodiripad, who's born in Kerala, becomes a phenomenally important person in the freedom movement as a young man. We are just actually going to publish a biography of this Marxist that most people have never heard of. He engages the tenancy question as an extremely young man. He writes a critique of the tenancy bill. Then he brings up the relationship between caste and class in the 1930s, spends the rest of his life writing about that. It's fascinating Marxist, and again, unfortunately, some of his best work is not in any other language but Malayalam, but we're going to try to bring bits and pieces of it out. So M.N. Roy is important, so is Namboodiripad. your precise question about Roy, in my opinion, his life story is actually much more interesting than the things he wrote. Although it should be said that his first book, which is on India, on the Indian reality, is one of the best conjunctural analyses of dependency in the colonies. It's a dependency theory book written in the 1920s, in 1921-22. In fact, there are a number of these people, De Silva in Sri Lanka and others, who wrote dependency theory but are not part of the oeuvre of dependency theory. Generally, that's thought of as a Latin American school. But, even later, Nkrumah's book is very much in the dependency tradition to stretch it geographically. Yeah.
So I had a question about what you spoke about circular theory versus essentially the linear approach to thinking. Would you have any thoughts on how that plays out in political organization? Because different parts of the world have a different community or a different philosophy of thinking, and circular thinking is something which is more commonly seen in, say, South Asia or even Southern Europe. So has that played a role in political organization in your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I haven't thought about that much, partly because our movements have been organized pretty conventionally. I mean, it has to be said that there was a lot learned from the Soviet experience and a lot not learned. What was learned was how to build a movement, and people succeeded in using those forms of building branches and mass organizations and so on. In fact, India is not the best example. The best example is China for utilizing the vocabulary and creating new forms. So we just published from Tricontinental a fantastic long essay. It's a dossier of this month by Professor Wang Hui from Tsinghua University. And Wang Hui goes into this conceptual thing where he says the term Soviet, as the Soviets understood it, when it comes to China and forms the Jingsu Soviet, they're using the term differently. It has a different meaning. Even the idea of masses or party, or what is the relationship of party to mass in China is different. People will say to me, well, China's an authoritarian, blah, 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 state, dictatorship, whatever. I always tell people like that, you've never been to Asia. You have no idea what Asian culture is like. Like, Asian culture is axiomatically a little hierarchical. Axiomatically, you got to be like, the elders have come in. I mean, I grew up in a super lefty kind of liberal environment. And if I was smoking a cigarette and I saw my uncle, communist, walking towards me, I would hide it behind my back. I would be like embarrassed to be seen as like a 20-year-old with a cigarette in front of my uncle because he's my uncle. He's a communist. What do I care? Freedom to do anything. Hierarchy is part of our cultural world, and how the Chinese took some of these concepts, relationship of party to mass, and bring it into their own cultural universe is really fascinating. I don't have time to get into all this, but it is fascinating how there are layers of meaning to some of these words, like masses or class even. They are not self-identical in each language. Even though you can translate a text, they mean something different. The Chinese Communist Party's leading role is different from a Communist Party elsewhere. It is seen in a way as a party that you trust implicitly to guide society. That's not a way that most people in other countries think of their political class, as a form, a form that you trust implicitly to guide society. That's a very interesting formulation. It's different than, if Trump becomes the president, the people in society trust him to guide society. I don't think people think of it as relationship of leadership to social development. They may think of it as to policy, not to guide society. That's a different understanding of the relation. I think partly, just to be honest, we're a little embarrassed to talk about cultural differences. People feel like this feels a little exaggerated, that, people are all the same. People are not the same. People are not the same. People are super different. They have different ideas of things. We shouldn't assume, where has he gone? Talked about equality and the logarithmic thing is disappeared. But, as he was saying that, it's the same with our own, how we live with an understanding of family, society. Super different ideas of family. obligations. We talk to a kid raised in an Indian family. The bloody obligations. I watch people say, yeah, I decided not to, my mother died. I decided, I just sort of called and said, I'm sorry about. I mean, here you got to go and smash the skull and all this stuff, it's heavy. Yeah, 2, 3 more and then we can close it down. Yeah, 10 minutes. Yeah.
About militancy and violence. Just going back, I was quite astonished a few months ago to see you post a photo of the daughter of Dian Aydin holding a copy of your book. For people that don't know, Dian Aydin was the last General Secretary of the Communist Party of Indonesia, which, as many know now, was subject to one of the most brutal massacres and acts of political violence in the 20th century at least. But it's an interesting case because, of course, the Communist Party of Indonesia was famously non-violent. It was a popular movement that established itself really as a non-violent movement. And I think it's very interesting in this story that you're talking about national liberation and Liberation Western Marxism, and how often we think that violence is something that's what the national liberation Marxists can do, or that's something that we experience from the state. We don't often talk about. I know this is potentially a bit.
No, I like where you're going, and I'm smiling in my head. Yeah.
Just see how you take it. But
yeah.
I wanted to
Just tell me why you were shocked to see the picture of Ibaruri with that book.
For people that don't know, Marxism and Leninism in Indonesia are still outlawed. To teach Marxism and Leninism in Later's 2019 was a new piece of legislation was passed to further outlaw the teaching and discussion of Marxist or Leninist texts. And to this day, many people on the left in Indonesia, they operate with a high degree of secrecy, which is really astonishing, I think. And for people that know that history know how deep those scars run and how taboo talking about communism and Marxism is. So it was just
that way shocking. Yeah. Yes. Firstly, just to point to my friend over there who said, thanks for raising this thing about Australia. I mean, the Australian government was sending telexes of lists of people to be eliminated to the Indonesian military.
Obama's mother.
Oh, yeah.
So supposedly may have been helping compile kill lists.
Make the kill list. And then the Australian intelligence services were telexing the list to military bases of who to kill in which district. Great country. Really good country. Happy to be here, guys. It's beautiful also. But it's also beautiful. Yeah, we went to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. We saw the Opera House. There was a huge cruise ship which was going from Sydney to Brisbane. For 8 days, $3,500. All you can eat, all you can drink, those chocolate fountains. Freedom! Freedom to drink and eat chocolate. What a great country. Anyway, it's not as bad as Americans, okay? Because they sent the longest list. Australian list was slightly shorter. By the way, we are going to see Australia versus Pakistan one-day game. We hope that Pakistan will win, but it's most unlikely. Most unlikely. Most unlikely. One thing about Australia is I've always hated the team, but I've always admired it. I hated the Australian team since I first saw Dennis Lilly bowl in Calcutta. How he could get the ball to bounce on a totally flat pitch. Thompson, the ball would be low and super fast. And looked like a thug. But Lilly looked beautiful bowling. I hated the team. They were so good. I admired them at the same time. Poor Indians, just not used to. You've seen Chiteshwar Pujara, who just stands there and gets hit. He just likes to turn his body and Stark hits him. Hazelwood hits him. He just doesn't move. But when Gavaskar was there, every ball Gavaskar just went forward and hours of no runs. Indian team was so annoying in those days. Anyway, we're going to see at the MCG Might buy that green baggy hat. Ibaruri is an incredibly brave woman, firstly. She is the daughter of Dian Edith, the last General Secretary of the Indonesian Communist Party. She was named after Dolores Ibaruri, La Pasionaria, the great Spanish Civil War communist. Okay, what a name to give a child. Iba. She is just completely brave, firstly. Super brave, doesn't care. She wants to make a selected works of her father's writing. She wants me to work with her to do that. I would love to publish some of his writings. But first, let's make the Sukarno. Let's make the collection of Sukarno. Let's study Sukarno. What kind of Marxism is there in Sukarno? Combination of Islam, nationalism. Let's get deep into it. Yeah? Let's look into it. I don't know if there's very many books that are good on Sukarno's thinking, but I'm interested in all of that, my friend. It was a bit crazy, but you got to be crazy. I'm looking forward to engaging more with Indonesia. I remember reading the old Indonesians, Malacca and so on. There's a great tradition there. I get it. I mean, I've given a couple of lectures online to Indonesian colleges. They always ask me to give a lecture on critical thinking. And you honor the fact that, if you're an idiot, they all go to jail. So, we got to talk about critical thinking, the importance of understanding inequality. It's a dance. It's a dance. But you also have to take some responsibility. Marxism is banned in Indonesia also thanks to the coup, which this country facilitated. One last one. Any hopeful question? Yeah. Oh, yeah, wait. No, he had a question. Then you take both and then we'll see. Okay? No, we'll take both and then see. I'll answer the best question. No. You are first. What is that flag?
Eureka flag.
Eureka flag.
It's not the Eureka stockade in Australia, before. It's from a trade union, so it's like a flag of the trade union.
Bravo.
Yeah, so we wear it. So I'm used to setting up.
Please, I love that. Yeah.
So, CJ, just had a question about how do you manage that sort of relationship between nationalism on the one hand and national liberation struggle? Because, for example, I'm wearing the symbol of Eureka now. It's a symbol in the Australian vision of, I guess, socialist struggle against capitalism in Australia. But how do you manage that sort of tension between trying to maintain an internationalist perspective when it comes to what we're trying to achieve here, while simultaneously trying to motivate people? And often you go into images and mythology and stories from our nation's history, to get people to mobilise. If I talk to people, I'm much more likely to get people motivated if I talk about Australian images of Australian history than I am to speak broadly speaking about international.
Absolutely. Well said.
That's my question, brother.
Very good question. You heard his question. Well, we better start with, I'm wearing a kafia because...
I'm not sure how my question will prepare, but just in the context of us Marxists doing conjectural analysis and I guess building a narrative out of people's common sense, what do we do when a lot of that common sense seems to be rooted in things like racism against migrants or ethnic groups here, or concerns about gay people or trans people and things like that?
Yeah, it's wonderful how the questions are actually the same in a way. Yeah, yours is more detailed. Let me start there and I'll come to you because it's a better place to end. So, see, my friend, first thing is when you do a conjunctural analysis, it's best not to sugarcoat the reality. And the issue isn't to, in a way, oppression check, ex-racist or homophobic or whatever. It's to ground why there is an element of racism at this point, where it comes from, what are the class basis of it. I mean, we have to try not to just sloganeer about hierarchies, but in a conjunctural analysis, discover, or at least attempt to discover, the roots of or the densities of those oppressions. Homophobia isn't a medical condition. It comes because it's part of a certain social development. So a conjunctural analysis should illuminate that. It should help you at least start provisionally with a theory of where or from how or for what reason does homophobia endure. Not that that's homophobic, this is homophobic. That's a very bad culture that has entered into a kind of liberal left. It's a liberalism entering the left, the culture of denunciation. You're homophobic, cancer. You're this, you're that. This is boring. Of course people are homophobic. Of course people are racist. That's not itself a medical problem that then you inoculate them with your denunciation. Yeah? You have to understand where it's coming from and then try to overcome both it and its roots. That's Marxism. Yeah, Marxism doesn't lead to liberal denunciation. It should lead to building unities with people to transform the whole system. Yeah, so it's super complicated and difficult to do this. It's not easy, but that's what you are there for. There is no such thing in my world as a Marxist intellectual and then somebody in a political organization. Every cadre is an intellectual. Every cadre must become an intellectual. Every intellectual should be a cadre. I don't see the role in Marxism for independent thinking. I don't understand what that means. Well, am I independent? What is an independent intellectual? Where are you rooted? Where do you stand? Do you stand on something? If you're independent, you're making a claim to God. It's theological. You have taken a God view. Nobody's independent. Where are you located? I would prefer to be located in historical dynamism, a movement, than to be located in an identity, which is stagnant. So that's what I would say. It's really hard to do, okay? I'm saying it as if it's some simple formula. Super hard to do. That's what makes you a good intellectual. The best intellectuals are able to peel away all the mediations, to identify the root cause of something. And that identifying the root cause isn't that you then pull out the carrot and say, look, I have a carrot. You start working the soil. That's the class struggle. The carrot is not coming out when you've identified it. The carrot will only come out in a struggle. The identification is a theory. We don't know actually if it's like that. As you advance the class struggle, you start getting a better understanding of the soil, the roots, and so on, and where to pull. Yeah? Terrible metaphor, but you get the point. Now, this is complicated because what the relationship between the nation, national liberation, is not the same in all nations. It depends where you are located in the world. If you are in Zambia today, formerly Southern Rhodesia, your nationalism has a different relationship to national liberation because you are firmly rooted in a struggle against imperialism. But in a country like Australia, nationalism is not necessarily rooted in a struggle against imperialism. In fact, nationalism can be put to the service of imperialism. Yeah, Ghassan Haj, who I know very well, I think he teaches here or somewhere, keeps getting attacked now because he writes in defense of Palestine. Ghassan wrote a book called White Nationalism about Australia. Okay, I don't know this country very well, okay? I read Stuart McIntyre's book on the plane, Concise History of Australia. I learned a lot from it. It's a very good book. He's a good historian, yeah? But anyway, the point is I don't know much, but I'm giving you my feeling about just some elements, yeah? I mean, nationalism in a country like this is not necessarily a contradiction against imperialism. On the other hand, two elements to this. One is every nation has a conflictual story. No nation has a clean history. Every nation around the world has an ugly history. There are brutalities inflicted upon people in every national story. It's impossible to say this is the Cuban Revolution is a clean story. There's all kinds of things we may not want to emphasize for whatever strategic reason. Or you want to and then discuss it. It's just not going to be in a straight line. Zigzags, all kinds of things, errors. This history is rather brutal, to say it mildly. Yeah, that has to be there in the thinking. So the first thing is, which story do you recover? There's that entire tradition that starts with A.L. Morton and others in England, the people's history tradition. which Howard Zinn picks up on and so on, to tell the story of a nation from those who are struggling to make it better. In other words, the margins of the nation are a better interpretation of the nation than the mainstream. This is a really insufficient approach because it sometimes sugarcoats the ugliness. Like, because trade unions came doesn't mean that other people weren't being massacred. If you told a history of trade unions and all the struggles and so on, it kind of accumulates Australia into a place of goodness that, hey, now we have the weekend because of the trade unions. But in fact, you just lost the weekend because people are precariously employed and so on. You can't have a Whig interpretation of history, a progressive interpretation just through the struggles. You have to also indicate its contradictions, a really ugly side of the history. That complex history is good for people to know. Like, if I'm in a trade union, I want to know a history that doesn't also talk about the sellouts, the people who screwed the trade union in the 1970s or whatever. I don't know. Yeah. The bosses that basically made a deal with whatever. We need that in the story as a warning, as a reflection piece, and so on. But that's only one part of it. See, the other interesting feature of it is that even in a country like Australia, not nationalism, but sovereignty could be an interesting theorem. You see, I'll give you an example. Everywhere I've been, I've asked people, how can you tolerate that you are spending money to expand the Tyndall Air Base in Darwin for the Americans to land B-52 bombers with nuclear bombs to go and bomb China? You are paying for the expansion. You are paying for the redevelopment of the Fremantle submarine base so the US can bring nuclear submarines. And at the same time, you don't have a high-speed rail that connects Sydney to Canberra, Canberra to Melbourne. Why did I have to get on a Qantas flight today and I had to lose my penknife and they almost took my blade away and fly when I could just take a train? But you're spending your resources for imperialism under which you are already subsumed since Sydney Bay. Because first subsumed to the British, then subsumed to the Americans after Treaty of San Francisco. Yeah? Why? That's sovereignty. You can make a demand. The Australian people can demand. We want high-speed rail. We don't want nuclear bombers. If it's a choice between using our wealth this way or that, we want this. That's sovereignty. That's different from nationalism. And sovereignty is a very interesting term to use in a country which has no treaty with the native people. Whose sovereignty? What sovereignty? So I think that nationalism is not actually the word we are looking for in a country like Australia. The word we are looking for is this is a country without sovereignty. It is a subordinate ally of the United States, and it has insufficiently had a relationship with those whom it expropriated. Let's advance along those two axes, stop being a subordinate ally of the US, sucking up to them, paying your money to expand their bases, and let's figure out a better relationship with those whom we took, whose land who we oppressed in a terrible way. Solve those two, you push those two dynamics, you create a new kind of nationalism. Not the old nationalism of the Australian flag, which is a fake nationalism. Because in fact, people who fly the Australia should stop doing it. And you can make the argument that on Australia Day or whatever it's called, they should fly the Australian flag, but the US flag should be above it. Thanks.